Kia ora and welcome. My name is David Sinfield and I'm Associate Professor at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand, where I teach communication design. Today's presentation will be on a research project I've been working on for about 5 years. Research has been based on the closure of the Freezing Works factory and cool stores, which was the main source of employment of the town, and the effect it had on the town and the wider community when it closed. For those of you that are not familiar with what a freezing works is, it is a place where animals, mainly sheep, are killed and prepared, then frozen, ready to be shipped overseas. Freezing works were New Zealand's first large-scale industry plants. A cool store is a refrigerated building that houses cheese ready for shipping overseas. This project is about people's stories and how I tell their stories. I've interviewed workers that were at the factory during its time of production, and I've listened to their stories. As an artist and designer in the digital arena, I use their stories for the creations of artworks. In this case, they are mainly poems, short films, and typefaces that capture the nature of their personalities. Partia Freezing Works was first established on the banks of the River Partia in 1883. In 1982, the factory closed its doors, which had a devastating impact on the town and the wider community of Partia. As a social construct and as an artist inquiry, this paper will consider the impact of the community with the closure of its main industry. Through a series of artistic works shaped from interviews of people that have worked at the factory, this paper will consider the artistic narratives of the community and the impact it had on its closure. According to Sharp, when artists participate with local communities, it can become a form of public art to engage with the communities and existing social struggles, to develop collaboration and dialogue with residents. He defines this approach as new genre public art and operates with connecting a community. In doing so, this paper will demonstrate how communities can engage with artists and how the town they live in can operate as an exhibition gallery of artistic artworks and narratives from the community. In doing this, this paper will reflect on the workers' stories through a series of artistic works and how they were exhibited throughout the town and embraced by the local community. It also gives concerns to communities having political agency when the artistic narratives are expressed and exhibited inside the local communities of the workers' lives, where they are being expressed and translated into artworks. Given this premise, the rationale for this study lies in the need to draw such stories to the surface so they enrich not only the historical account but also the manner in which we might think about recollection. The paper proposes that there are typographical poetic ways of telling stories. Conventional recordings often tend to be media specific, and oral history is normally an audio recording without images. A social or environmental report normally contains statistics and records without regional dialect. A photograph is an image without sound. Few of these approaches to documenting narratives of experience fuse media in such a way that content, personality, and emotion coexists. If we are to record histories richly, perhaps we might consider how they are constructed and the manner in which they become available to people living in the spaces in which they unfold. The physical establishment of Partia. One of the earliest publications about Partia is the Sir John Coode report in 1897 that records the proposed redesigning and structure of the river bar and the layout of the town of Carlisle that was later to be named Partia. A plan drawn in this report proposed that Mr. Carruthers shows the layout of the constructional works for the harbour. This was eventually to become part of the Party of Freezing Works and Cool Stores that were established in 1883. In 1901, dairy produce was added to the complex, and along with this came the construction of the cool stores. At this time, the factory evolved into Party of Freezing Works Cooperative, and it became South Taranaki's primary employer. These additions made Party the largest cheese exporting port in the world. In 1904, in addition to the canning of mutton, beef, and pork, freezing facilities were introduced to the site, and Party became one of the first companies to export frozen meats globally. The company continued to grow over the next 80 years, and in its height, it employed over 900 people. Correspondingly, the town of Party grew around the factory, and the facilities of its associated functions formed the main source of income in the area. During the 1970s and the 1980s, the site developed a reputation for strikes and industrial action brought about mainly by underproductiveness and the changing tides of exports. This period also saw overproducing capacity throughout New Zealand, with Party becoming one of the first factories to close its doors in August 1982. Patia is a small town with a population of just under 1100, located on the western bank of the Patia River in the district of South Taranaki on the North Island of New Zealand. On various site visits to the town and the derelict factory, I explored the abandoned freezing work buildings, filming its location and surrounding area, interviewing people who had worked at the factory before it closed in 1982. Using extracts from the interviews, I developed a range of artistic works, such as poem films and typefaces that capture the nature of speech and emotional resonances within the participants' recollections. These works speak to recollection experience and associations with place. This paper, I will explore the methods used and the findings of artistic works and how they were exhibited within the town of Partia. Site reflective, poetic, typographical texts that recycle spoken narrative back into local community as artistic works. Although time has moved on and some 40 years has passed, I managed to interview 4 workers that had worked in the factory before it closed in 1982. They told the story of the love of the place and the camaraderie of the workforce, what it was like to work in the freezing works, what the town looked like, and the effects the closure of the factory had on the town and the community. From these interviews, a series of artistic works was produced that led them to being displayed in the town of the local shops, cafes, and nearby museum. A series of short poem films were produced along with the design posters. Further studies led to the designing and construction of typefaces that spoke of local dialect. Upon visiting the factory in 40 years of neglect, I walked amongst the collapsed buildings, fallen ceilings, crumbling walls, and years of vegetation that had taken over from the once human occupation. I am aware of the dangers within this place as I become the indweller. By indwelling, I refer to the state of embodied open awareness that I achieved by walking, sitting, standing, and listen as I walk around the abandoned factory. In such a state, I become the indweller. I waited with and immerse myself in a process of turning inward to seek a deeper, more extended comprehension of the nature or meaning of the quality of the theme of human experience. In this state, I dwelled within questions that were not sharply defined, searching for non-explicit. Here I draw on both poetic and tacit knowing, both of which resourced emotional reactions that would be artistically interpreted later in the research. This method normally constituted my initial engagement with a site. It was always conducted away from the company of other people because I relied on higher sensitized and attuned state of waiting, watching, and listening. In this state, I felt myself away around heuristically in a discerning personal involvement that constituted an effort to know some aspects of life through the internal pathways. When I am there, I take photographs, record ambient sounds, and moving image film stocks. These are field notes, a collection of images that, not knowing at that stage what will materialize. I record these images as heuristic manner, knowing that when I return to my studio, these images will form the basis of my works somehow. When it comes to producing the artworks, I am continually seeking ways of introducing atmospheric tension to my images, trying to recapture the tension I felt whilst being there. From these, the backdrop of the artistic works that I produced, such as posters that were displayed in the town and images used in the poem films. In this example, you can see how the collapsed ceiling top left, not a particularly interesting photograph in its original state, but one that does show the extent of the abandonment and the erosion through time. The picture to the right was an internal wall, soaked with years of rain and mould. In a strange way, I feel the combination of erosion and growth in a strange, like symbiotic relationship. When the two images are combined and manipulated with the digital arena, it gives the feeling I am looking for: dark, foreboding, eroded, forgotten, inquisitive. In creating these works, data from the film field was edited and then written across to construct poetic reflections. I edited the film footage using Adobe Premiere Pro software, and I constructed words in After Effects or from filmed handmade experience. I then embedded the new material into the filmed footage. The roughly edited footage provided me with a substrate from which I could manipulate visual materials, sound, color, and movements. These experiments may be understood as intuitive drafts. In this process, I utilize editing as a method of discovering potential. The intuitive process of refinement involvement what Donald Scholl calls move testing and experimentation. In such instances, as each development in the project reveals potentials, the practitioner performs a specific task in order to see what happens. Through move testing incrementally, a sense of what works and what doesn't occurs for a process of reflecting on and in action. This leads intuitively towards the refinement of a cohesive, poetic narrative of experience. I have made a collection of poem films that reflect the narratives from the workers I interviewed. Due to time restraints in this presentation, I cannot show you them all, but please feel free to copy the QR code so that you can view them at your own convenience. In a coming slide, I will, however, show one of the short poem films, Strike. Strike, a poem film. Set against the revelation of the word strike, in this piece, John Macbeth, a former labourer at the works, talks about the industrial action that took place in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Physicality and psychological, John weathered not only the economic impact of involuntary job loss, but also the toxic environment of the factory and the residue of erosion and place. From this piece, I also created a series of typefaces based on his experience and the emotional narrative he gave. The typeface Strike was used for this piece and cut from wood and filled on a rolling rig. In the next slide, we'll play the poem film, which is approximately 2 minutes.
Divided before, and I still believe in that. And I was part of the union, always have been, and probably always will. Well, not now, I'm retired, but very strong locally and nationally. Like there would be national strikes with all over the country. The freezing works would be out on strike. And if one had a strike, like we had a strike, other freezing works would financially support, the other workers would support our plant. And then in later years we got down to departmental strikes. We'd stay at work and we'd support the ones that were out on strike. A lot of the strikes were engineered by the company. I think they wanted to close it. I'll go back a bit. There's a lot of money put forward to rebuilding the place. Plans are out and everything. And if you go up to the museum over there, you might, I don't know if there's anything over there or not. And then Timona, which was part of the Vesta Group, had a fire over in Hastings, and the money that was going to come here was all channelled over there. And it was, yeah, and we had a manager come out from England, and he was, him and his cohort, Paul Jones, they decided they were going to close it or beat us, and in the end they closed it.
Typeface design may be seen as an approach to creative processing that drew on both explicit and potentially sensed data. Broadly, this is a method where a creative synthesis occurs through iterative refinement. In this process, interpretive letterforms and spatial treatments are used to interpret the nature of recorded voices. The approach began with a careful analysis of audio recorded interviews. Here, I was especially tentative to the dialect, tone, emphasis, pitch, pauses, intonation patterns, and variations in speed. In addition to these technical features, I also thought about gender, personality, occupation, and the content of the speaker's recollection. These features I began to interpret as letterforms. Through a process of trial and error, I began to refine elements and relationships, often returning to the audio data when I was interpreting and refining on a specific feature of speech of the character. However, when designing typographical responses, I was not simply making interpretive letterforms. I was designing fully functional families of type. So in addition to consideration the face's potential variants, such as light, regular, compressed, italic, bold, etc., I also experimented with the formal technical challenges of spacing. These can be seen as leading and kerning. The impact of ascenders and descenders on words from the functionality of the face when used as body type. The method of designing these faces moved in and out of dialogues with imagery and sound because the development of each of these aspects impacted on the form and nature of the other. For example, when I applied atmospheric sound to a typeface as it played out in an environment, I would observe things that caused me to rethink letterforms for their clarity. A pronounced example of this dialogic relationship between sound and type design occurred when the design of a typeface time. It was only after testing an initial response to Mrs. Joy Macbeth's speech excerpt that I became aware of her distinct pronunciation of vowels like I, and the manner in which the pace of her speech challenged conventional approaches to letter spacing. Watching the typeface while listening to the sound of her voice caused me to reconceptualize both kerning and the need for hybrid letter forms within the design. In this slide, you can see the constructions of the phonic glyphs of the letters O and I of the typeface time. The poem films, documentary, broadsheet, and typographical posters that comprise the outward substance of this inquiry were not exhibited in a white-walled art gallery. After 5 years of visiting Partia and interviewing, filming, and collating information, I felt that it was important to give back to the community the synthesis of what they had so generously shared with me. Over the years I had spent developing the project, I have forged deep connections with the community, including the local museum, the public library, and individual business owners. Drawing upon this goodwill, I exhibited 2 bodies of work in the town. The first was in Partier's museum, and the second was an augmented reality exhibition distributed throughout the town on the walls and in shop windows. This took the form of individual posters. When local people held their mobile devices up to the QR codes positioned at the bottom of each poster, the poem film would play on their phone or mobile device. Although Partia doesn't have an art gallery, I would not have exhibited the work I produced in such a location. Traditionally, the art galleries, with its whitewashed walls and engineered lighting, is a social prescribed space. The artworks needed to be displaced within the town amongst the people's stories that were being told. This means that the contents are connected to the lived experience of local people. Thus, they are living the contents in the world outside of the art gallery. People see their historical images of themselves, their town, their friends, and their families. There are stories inside the community associated with what they encounter. In this regard, for the many local residents, much of the material may operate as a catalyst for remembered first-hand experience of what occurred when the factory's closure happened. I was appreciative of the fact that what I designed would not be sealed off from existing material, but integrated into what existed. What would be no special lighting, no prescribed designated space, no contribution would speak in the context of existing narratives of the community. Because of the generosity of local retailers, the posters activated the poem films were able to be displayed concurrently throughout the town. I owe the community of Partia a huge debt of gratitude for the manner in which they embrace this research. To conclude, contextualizing the film poems within the wider study is a 14-minute documentary I designed called Partia the Project. The aim of this work was to provide an overview of the research. The advantage of a documentary is that I was able to work with sound files, visual and narrative transitions, and discussions that were not easily integrated into the written text. The work provides an outline of the historical context of the freezing works and an introduction to the 4 main research participants: John Macbeth, Bruce Phillips, Joy Macbeth, and James Clark. It then offers an account of my typographical experiments and the exhibition of the poem films. This documentary was also displayed within the town itself. Thank you very much for listening.